Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, after a 2-month standoff, France's announcement that it will bring home about 1,500 counterterrorism troops back from Niger and recall its ambassador is hailed at home as a win for the Niamey junta. Also, just months after the UN Security Council greenlights its peacekeepers' exit from Mali after being invited to do so by Bamako, the new report warns of a crisis of consent between the body and many countries relying on its help. And 500 swimmers of all ages take to the waters around Senegal's capital for the 34th Dakar-Gorée swim. Both professionals and amateurs jump feet first into the challenge. But first, there have been celebrations in the Nigerian capital in the wake of France's announcement that it would recall its ambassador immediately and pull all of its troops out of Niger by the end of the year. The decision comes after 2 months of defiance from Paris, and it's being hailed as a diplomatic victory for Niger's military junta. Take a look.
It was the end of a standoff. French President Emmanuel Macron has ceded to the demands of Niger's ruling junta and agreed to recall his ambassador and withdraw military forces. Following Sunday's announcement, hundreds of people in Niamey gathered outside the airbase housing French troops to celebrate.
The French can leave because they have failed militarily. They have failed diplomatically. From the moment the French ambassador was declared persona non grata, he must leave.
It's followed nearly 2 months of back and forth. On one side, Niger's new military rulers, hungry for international recognition and strongly opposed to France's military presence. And on the other side, a French government that has struggled to keep hold of its influence in a country hosting more than 1,500 of its soldiers. A joint military partnership between Niger and France called Operation Al-Mahou had been making progress in the fight against terrorism. But in the wake of Niger's July the 26th coup, some in the country feel confident it can tackle terrorist groups on its own.
We have to be able to fight terrorism, otherwise we will be crushed. If the terrorists are our fellow countrymen, why shouldn't we be able to combat them?
However, since the overthrow of President Bazoum and the subsequent suspension of foreign military alliances, Niger has seen a rise in extremist violence.
Well, now to another military junta in the region that's been putting some distance between itself and France, Mali. Its leaders have said that they're pushing back elections that had been due to be held next February. Now, the junta said that the delay to the polls that were key to the return to democratic rule is because of technical hold-ups. The timetable was already 2 years behind schedule. A new date has yet to be set. Now, another concern for Mali in the wake of its 2021 coup is its ability to tackle a persistent extremist insurgency. Despite that, earlier this year, in June, the UN Security Council unanimously approved the complete withdrawal of its MINUSMA peacekeeping operation in Mali at Bamako's request. Now, a new report has unpicked some of the complexities of the contract between host countries and UN peacekeepers to better understand why some client nations are running out of patience with peacekeepers. The UN's 4 largest and most visible operations are in Africa: Central African Republic, DR Congo, South Sudan, and Mali. Now, their impact and even existence is affected by these frayed relations. Lisa Sharland is one of the report's authors, and she joins us now. Lisa, thanks so much for talking to us. Now, first of all, the UN Security Council began drawing down its peacekeeping troops at Bamako's request in June, as we mentioned there. How has this concept of a crisis of consent played into what we've seen happen there?
Thanks, Georgia. Well, as you've indicated there, the request by the Security Council to withdraw that mission in June followed, I think, months, if not a couple of years, of a difficult relationship between the host authorities and the Security Council and the UN peacekeeping mission. And what this has highlighted is a growing gap in expectations between host countries and the Security Council with regards to mission mandates and the role of UN peacekeeping. In this case, Mali wanted the mission to focus on security and addressing the terrorist threat in the region. And that had previously generally been the focus of other security partners which had started to withdraw, such as the French and the G5 Sahel. It also wanted the mission to focus much less on human rights. It was incredibly critical of the UN human rights report into the massacre that took place in Mura, and it had kicked out the mission's head of human rights component. So in summary, it viewed the mission and has stated that it viewed it as ineffective. But at the same time, I think we need to acknowledge that part of the reason the mission was crippled in many ways was because of the obstructions that the Malian authorities had put in place, controls over the use of airspace by the peacekeeping missions, violation of the Status of Forces Agreement. And these are some of the things that we point to that have occurred in different peacekeeping missions in our recently released report.
Now, that report also points out that this impatience being seen on the continent with UN peacekeepers is part of a broader phenomenon being played out across Africa. So where else have you flagged up concerns, and what are the big picture drivers of this?
Well, we see some of these tendencies at the moment playing out in the developments in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, for instance. We've had calls from the president there for the mission to expedite its withdrawal timeline towards the end of this year. And in part, they have pointed in particular to what is the perceived ineffectiveness in the way that these missions carry out their mandates and serve in the countries where they're deployed. Now, one of the challenges here is that many of these missions have been deployed, in some cases, for many decades. And so there is a lot of tension there and grievances around how effective these missions are. You also have, in many contexts, the spread of disinformation. And as I pointed to before, these obstructions that are sometimes put in place in various missions that are deployed. So that is part of the tension there, even though there is evidence that emerges from research that peacekeeping missions have an impact on the ground. The second challenge that a lot of these contexts are facing at the moment is the divisions that we see in the UN Security Council, which have really heightened some of these tensions. The Council is not united in calling out when there are obstructions in missions from carrying out their mandates. We see a lack of unanimity when it comes to adopting mandate renewals, in part because differing views on how the Council should engage with host countries. So you see this tension between what the mission should be doing and the tension between what a peacekeeping mission is meant to do. And then I think the final point is that tension between the security focus of these missions, and we do see a preference by some countries to look to other partners, whether they be bilateral partners. We've seen Russia and Wagner, for instance, or similarly the role of sub-regional or regional economic community organisations that are deployed in contexts such as the DRC, where the East African community is currently deployed.
And is that growth of more choice when it comes to the potential security partners for countries on the continent a problem?
It comes with some risks, and I think these need to be mitigated. And while it's the choice of the host authorities, often these missions deploy with less safeguards than have been developed in the context of UN peacekeeping missions over the last few decades. Now, UN peacekeeping is by no means perfect, but at the same time, it has developed a lot of safeguards around human rights, protection of civilians. And the other challenge here relates to funding. And there is a debate playing out at the moment about how a number of these different security entities will be funded in terms of carrying out their operations. And we see this debate with it coming before the UN Security Council in relation to African Union-led operations in the coming months. So it isn't necessarily that there's choice about these missions, but it's ensuring that the right missions are being deployed, that have the right tools and can address issues related to the political process and conflict prevention, and that they're not just focused on security. And so in these instances, it's really important to understand what some of those differences are. And I think, understanding what the tensions are around cooperation and consent are essential to that.
Thank you very much. Lisa Sharlin, they're one of the report's authors looking into some of the frayed trust between some of the nations that have accepted UN peacekeepers in Africa. Now, Kenya and the US have signed a defense cooperation agreement aimed at strengthening their fight against counterterrorism in the region. The US has become increasingly involved in sub-Saharan Africa, from operating bases across the Sahel to using drones to target al-Shabaab extremists in Somalia. Our correspondent reports.
The Defense Cooperation Agreement that has been signed includes promises by the US to provide Kenya with more training, more personnel, more investment and more military equipment to ensure greater security in the region and beyond. Now, the greatest threat to the region's security is al-Shabaab, the Somalia-based al-Qaeda-affiliated terrorist organization. The US has been fighting the terror group over the past few years from Kenya's Lamu coastal coastal region which borders Somalia. Now, that's where 3 Americans were killed in an Islamist attack back in 2020. And now the US Defense Secretary Austin said in his speech in Nairobi on Monday that huge progress has been made in fighting the terrorist organization. He said that more progress has been made in the past year and a half than in the past 5 years combined. Now, the Defense Secretary's visit to Kenya comes as part of a week-long tour of Africa. It's the latest in a series of US diplomatic visits to the continent, and this really suggests a growing awareness that that America needs to deepen its engagement with the continent, especially in the face of growing competition from Russia and China, and as France withdraws its troops from the continent. So the US is really trying to say that they're still here and that they still have an important role to play in Africa.
Olivia Bizet there for us. Now, at least 34 people died in Benin in an explosion at an illegal fuel depot over the weekend. The country is a major destination for gas smuggled in from neighbouring Nigeria. Clarice Fortuné has more.
This is what's left of one of the burnt vehicles after the blaze. Remaining carcasses in what used to be a depot for smuggled fuel in the town of Senegal. Damages are impressive, but even more so, the human losses.
I myself have 4 members of my family who perished in the flames. My younger brother, same father, same mother, and his eldest son, my brother's wife, and my brother-in-law's wife.
We have unfortunately recorded 34 deaths, including 2 babies. The cause of the fire was fuel, particularly contraband fuel. We have also recorded 20 injuries of varying severity.
For decades, contraband fuel was transported illegally by road to Benin from neighboring Nigeria, to be then resold on the black market. When Nigerian President Bola Tinubu scrapped the fuel subsidy, petrol prices tripled, impacting its neighbor and highlighting Benin's deep economic dependence on its neighbor.
And Egypt set a date for elections for the 10th to 12th of December. President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has yet to announce his candidacy, but state media has already started to supply messages of support. Our correspondent tells us more.
So Egypt's National Election Authority announced that the presidential elections will be held on 10, 11 and 12 of December this year. And you see they go to great lengths to convince their audience these elections will be free, fair and transparent. And they hold 2 major press conferences in which they gave detailed presentations about the precise process and procedures of these elections. So clearly it's very important for them that these elections are perceived as credible. And they want to convince the world and their own population that Egypt is a democracy and not a dictatorship. Previous elections in Egypt have actually drawn a lot of criticism for being quite the opposite of fair and free. President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi is in power since 2014 and was re-elected in 2018. During those elections, 2 potential challengers of Sisi were arrested and several others withdrew after being intimidated. The President Sisi has yet to announce his official candidacy for this election, but several other politicians have announced their candidacy. One of them is Ahmed al-Tantawi. He is a critic of the government and he said that he intends to run for these elections. However, 35 volunteers of his campaign have already been arrested in past weeks. Also, the National Election Authority, in their press conferences, issued some veiled threats towards journalists. They said that spreading rumors about the integrity of this election is a violation of the elections code and could actually constitute a crime.
Now, finally, hundreds of swimmers took to the waters of Gorée Island in Senegal's capital, the 34th annual open water swim. It's not only a fun community challenge, but also a chance for some of the more serious athletes with their eye on the 2026 Youth Olympics that's due to be held in the country to dip their toe into the competitive waters. Take a look.
bu neex la natation ci dëkk bi comme amuñu benn activité à part ça ñu foo ambiance ak yëpp ñu ngi koy dund daal.
Ce matin midi soir maa ngi doon entraîné comme tey su ma ñëwee classé premier xamoon naa ni dinaa mën a jël premier quoi.
Looking good, guys. Well, that's it, though, for Eye on Africa. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Till then, take care.